Welcome to episode 10 of the Muni Credit Cast from BAM Mutual. I'm Mike Stanton, joined as always by BAM's Chief Credit Officer, Suzanne Finnegan. For today's episode, we're going to take a deep dive into the higher education sector, and we're going to be joined by Liz Clark, the Vice President for Policy and Research for the National Association of College and University Business Officers, NACUBO, along with Alex Vaisman, who heads BAM's higher education group in our public finance department. Before we get to them, Suzanne, I'm hoping you can start by laying out the roadmap for how you analyze college and university bonds. Am I right to think that higher education is one of the most complex sectors you deal with here at BAM?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Yes, I think that's correct, because colleges and universities really have very extensive operations, so you have to look at a wide range of factors, including the normal financial questions about revenues, expenses, and fiscal stability. But you also have to consider that the competition for education services are nationwide, if not global. And so you have to look much deeper into the operations of each school. What majors does it offer? How selective is it in its admission policy? More selectivity usually means more demand from potential students, and that usually translates into less volatility in enrollment levels. Affordability. And then finally, does the institution have an endowment that can help it to weather financial storms?
Thanks for all of that. And we're going to take a deeper dive into all of those issues with our guests in just a moment. But before we do, I want to ask one more question up here at the 30,000-foot level. Within the higher education sector, we see both public and private institutions. And within the municipal bond market, both public and private institutions are able to sell municipal bonds. How distinct is the analysis between those two types of schools?
Well, I think that the analyst winds up asking virtually the same questions to both institutions, but the answers are often different, and the metrics and levels are often different. So public colleges and universities usually have very strong ties to state government, and that can impact the answers to the questions around demand, selectivity, and affordability. The universe of private colleges and universities can have a lot more variability from school to school.
Great. Well, thanks for setting us up with the context here, Suzanne. Let's get on with the interviews. Welcome back, and thanks to our guests for joining us, Alex Vaisman, BAM's Head of Higher Education, and Liz Clark, the VP for Policy and Research for the National Association of College and University Business Officers. We always try to remind listeners that you need to listen to our podcasts in the context of when they're recorded, and right now that's particularly important because one of the topics we're going to talk about, the federal government's role in supporting colleges and universities, is changing quickly. So what we talk about as we record this today, February 19th, is accurate now, but listeners should stay focused on the news going forward this year. So Liz, with that disclaimer, let's go ahead and start with what you're hearing from your members. What are the top concerns for college and university business officers right now?
Wow. Where do I start? I will first start with just a simple thank you for having me here. Our college and university members, we work primarily with the chief business officers or CFOs or COOs at colleges and universities, and they are drinking from a fire hose right now. There are any number of concerns out there that they're paying attention to when it comes to what's happening in Washington. First, there are a lot of concerns about that federal funding freeze memo that came out a couple of weeks ago now. There was a lot of confusion when that memo came out because it it did not include many details and many definitions of what was included, what was not included, and there were some questions before the White House clarified as to whether that funding freeze also included student financial aid. That would be Pell Grants, work study, student loans that come from the federal government. And so colleges and universities and their students were very concerned. The White House clarified they didn't mean to include Pell Grants or student loans, and later there was a temporary restraining order put on that federal funding freeze memo. We're still awaiting the final outcome of that federal freeze, and should the courts side with the White House, there will be a lot of disruption for colleges and universities because there are so many partnerships between universities and the federal government, mostly in the research area, also in the student aid and education area. But when you think about a university and their research enterprise, they are conducting a lot of research supported by the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, the Department of Defense, and the programs that the federal government funds at colleges and universities would all be affected by that freeze memo, and it would take a lot of time to sort out what was being put on hold. So that freeze memo, again, we believe that the courts will keep that funding freeze at bay, but it's entirely uncertain until we see where that goes. There was also an issuance from the Trump administration that gets into a weedy topic of indirect cost reimbursement. So I mentioned all this research that colleges and universities conduct, significantly supported by the National Institutes of Health. Again, I mentioned the Department of Defense. It also includes NASA, NOAA, the USDA, the Department of Energy. But what happened recently is that the federal government significantly limited the indirect cost reimbursement rate that goes to colleges and universities. And this limitation also now under a temporary restraining order, but should the courts uphold the White House wishes here, would cost colleges and universities millions of dollars. They are going to have to make some decisions as to whether or not they can continue certain research programs happening across their campuses right now. They will be making decisions about jobs, and I think already before we know where the courts will side on this lowering of the indirect cost reimbursement rate, colleges and universities are already looking at programs across their campus and thinking about them in terms of red light, green light, yellow light. What can they afford to continue, and what will they make sure continues? What might they slow down until there is more certainty and predictability from the federal government? And what might have to be put on hold if they can't get the indirect cost rate required to run a program? Or going back to this funding freeze, if there is some type of funding freeze across campus. Other federal government uncertainties right now include what's happening with the federal workforce. Members of the federal workforce are the people who help support that relationship. So, for example, when there is a grant from the National Science Foundation that a college or university is working on, they typically have a point of contact at the National Science Foundation to help them work through all of the nuts and bolts related to that project and that partnership. With all of the turnover that's happening right now, there's just simply a lot of confusion about where things go from here. So that's a snapshot in terms of actions from the White House just within the past month. Then there are the usual controversies.
So before you go on to the other controversies, I just want to stay there for a second. So as you talk about the indirect cost issue, this is kind of just a question that's been bubbling in my mind. You know, are there universities out there that have engaged in capital investments? Have they built laboratories? Have they built physical plant to support this kind of work, expecting that the cost of that, whether bond funded or not, might be recovered through an indirect cost? Is it tied back to infrastructure that way?
Yeah, absolutely. There is a direct connection to infrastructure. The people hear the term indirect cost, and I think some people think that that's a squishy cost, but really indirect costs are real costs. They are the cost of heating and cooling a building. They are the costs of taking out the trash, keeping a building clean. And when a college or university is thinking about all of the financial inputs that go into a science building, a laboratory, wet labs, perhaps if they're operating a clinical environment at a university-affiliated hospital, they could be doing clinical trials, and all of the costs related to that research are part of the calculations that colleges and universities make in terms of what they can support when it comes to a new capital project.
So before I cut you off, I think you're about to talk about some of the broader issues facing the sector. What else is on their radar?
Yeah, I was going to go to even more uncertainties from Washington first. In addition to the broader challenges that are out there, right now, Congress is trying to work through appropriations, and every year appropriations are a battle. So this is not entirely a new circumstance, but we are a little concerned about the possibility of a federal government shutdown and what that will mean with President Trump in the White House. And beyond that, Congress is also planning to enact some type of tax reform legislation this year. And with that, Congress is trying to deliver on extending the Trump tax cuts that were put in place in 2017. I think Republicans on Capitol Hill want to help deliver for President Trump some of his other goals, like not taxing tips, not taxing Social Security, and not taxing overtime income. But when you eliminate those revenue streams, it creates budget challenges. And so we have lawmakers looking for coins in the couch cushion on how to pay for those tax cuts that President Trump has requested. And some of the items on the menu, very publicly on the menu, because a list leaked from the House Budget Committee with menu options. And on that menu option were the elimination not just of the private activity bond opportunity, but all munis. And so colleges and universities, in addition to facing all of these uncertainties, and if they were already thinking about some type of major capital project, are now facing the uncertainty of whether or not, when they're ready to issue debt, whether there will be a tax-exempt market available. And on top of that, they face the uncertainty of how construction costs might change under the new tariff regime.
So, Alex, let's get you into the conversation here. As you're listening to this and you think about your approach to analyzing institutions, is there a way to isolate this federal impact, and what are you seeing so far?
Sure. Thanks, Mike. So I think just to start off the conversation, as kind of Liz pointed out through sort of its various kind of actions to date, I would say the new administration has introduced kind of increased uncertainty and scrutiny to the sector. And I think what's also important to recognize is that we're still in the early days of the administration, right? So as they're continuing to conceptualize sort of their policies for post-secondary education, certainly we at BAM are constantly kind of monitoring the news for activity to try and figure everything out. And, I think from our perspective, ultimately, the impact on credit will depend in part on how management teams kind of plan for and respond to the changing landscape. So for instance, Liz had touched on sort of federal grants and contracts just a few minutes ago. But for instance, from our perspective, should they be kind of delayed or cut or adversely modified in some way, for instance, with the overhead cost recovery? That's going to be sort of a hard decision, as Liz kind of pointed out, that management teams will need to kind of decide how they want to go about that. Are they going to use their own funds to address any shortfalls, which could obviously pressure the bottom line and potentially lead to a drawdown of reserves? Alternatively, they could obviously choose to reduce research-related expenditures, which may, among other things, affect their ability to recruit and or retain top academic talent. So there's obviously going to be a bit of sort of, some kind of cost-benefit analysis that will need to be done on a case-by-case basis there. I think kind of even going beyond what's happening right now at the federal level, which is a lot, there's certainly a lot of things that are happening sort of at the sector level. I would be remiss if I didn't mention sort of demographics as another area that we're monitoring, with the number of 18-year-olds in the United States kind of projected to decrease in the coming years. Obviously, this is not breaking news. It's something that we've all heard about and been tracking for some time. However, going back to sort of the federal side of the piece, immigration policy is certainly something that's of increased focus. And should those immigration policies change in such a way that diminish enrollment from overseas markets, that could further kind of reduce the total supply of prospective students that may have attended post-secondary education in the States. So that's something that we're monitoring. And again, as Liz pointed out, there's so many things happening, going beyond sort of the points that we had talked about, there are possible new efforts to tax the endowment. There are possible sort of policy shifts related to the accreditation process. And even extending to the U.S. Department of Education itself. Who knows what that's going to look like. I think overall, to sum it up, it's a really busy time for anyone covering the sector right now. There's just a lot going on.
Liz, can I ask, when your members inside the culture of their institutions, how engaged are they in shaping those management decisions for this whole broad spectrum of issues the institutions are facing, not just the federal policy issues, but the demographic changes and these things? How much does the finance department get to speak up to the president's office, speak up to the board of trustees, and help them chart their path?
Yeah, they are integrally involved. Most business officers, typically they have a title of Vice President for Finance Administration. They may also have a CFO title, again, perhaps a COO title. They sit on the president's cabinet. Most college and university presidents and chancellors has a team of senior leaders that they work with to shape goals and strategy for the institution, and the chief business officer is typically right there. And also with the board, what we've found at NACUBO in our surveys is that business officers, CFOs, VPs for finance administration, in most cases serve more board committees than any other senior leader. Typically, they're involved with the risk committee, the investment committee, the budget committee, and they could be involved with even more committees beyond that. So they are very, very much aligned and in partnership with the president and the board of trustees.
So I think bond people would probably find that reassuring.
Yeah.
Another question is just, we talked in the intro with Suzanne about how diverse the universe is of colleges and universities. And I'm sure that's represented in your membership. Are the questions and the priorities the same at a lot of these institutions? Do you have to kind of pick and choose, the common denominator topics that are going to appeal to all of your members, or how do you serve that?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it is so true. I often say once you know one university, you know one university. We see differences between the public sector and the private sector, and frankly, laws and rules treat them differently. We see differences between research universities, those with teaching hospitals affiliated with them, and universities that are perhaps more regional or smaller, whether they're rural or urban, a household name or not, they are all facing different pressures. Added to that, we're also seeing significant differences by geographic region. We are seeing much more enrollment downward pressure in the Northeast than we are in the Southwest, for example. The South and Southwest have much stronger enrollment positions than some of the colleges and universities in the Northeast right now, for example.
So Alex, building on that, I'm wondering if you could kind of, get down to the level of analytics and how you're analyzing a college or university credit. What are the inputs? What are the key data points you're looking at?
Sure. Thanks, Mike. So I think before we dive into sort of the data points, as Liz pointed out, no university is alike. So it's crucial ourselves first to kind of ground ourselves in the fundamentals to figure out sort of the general profile of the institution. And, much like Liz had said, is it a sort of where is it located? Is it a residential or commuter school? Is it public or private? Is it research oriented? Is it geared toward a particular student body? Kind of what sets it apart from its peers? we really need to kind of go for that process. Personally, what I like to do as part of this endeavor is I actually enjoy going on the university's website to see how it markets itself, as well as to better understand kind of its overall brand. And I think, once we've kind of gone through that due diligence process and have a good feel for the school, that's when we start digging into the numbers. And that includes both the financial and operating data. So I would say among sort of the key data points that I'm looking at, to start would be kind of the trends on the enrollment and demand side of the equation. Things like headcount, selectivity, matriculation rates, retention, and so forth. Things that are, I think, fairly obvious, but still rather important when you're looking at these institutions. Obviously, the financial health of the school is critical from our perspective. So we're taking a look at things like scale, revenue diversity, whether or not they're producing a surplus, the extent to which the university has sufficient unrestricted reserves to deal with any anticipated budgetary variances, kind of things like that. And I'd say, given the fact that at the end of the day, we're credit analysts here at BAM, we're obviously also hyper-focused on the debt side of the equation. And, among other things, sort of the level of financial leverage, just to make sure that that's reasonable, to make sure that that is affordable, things like that. I think it's also important to kind of switch gears and think about sort of what other kind of data is out there, right? Because you have the data that's kind of readily available to you in terms of sort of the audits, sort of the operations, things like that. But we also like to kind of step outside and kind of take a look at sort of the other items that are out there that are pertinent from our perspective. And certainly some things to highlight would include going to the accreditor's website to make sure that the university is in good standing. I think it's important to just do a quick Google search to get a sense as to what's happening sort of on the ground at the school, sort of in real time. And something that I think is also important is, when possible, when it's readily available, to really go for the institution's website, try and find its strategic plan, and really kind of go for that to get some visibility on the action plan on the part of management, sort of to look forward, as well as the extent to which leadership is actually laying out clear KPIs for measuring its own success. Kind of that kind of accountability and goal setting is fairly important from our perspective.
So a few times a year, we'll see a headline about a college closing its doors. And so, Alex, obviously you're keeping an eye on those through your industry research. Are there any red flags that are kind of common to those experiences that investors can look for ahead of time?
Sure, great question, Mark. And I think it's important to do a quick step back first in order to provide some context for what's going on. So we, I'd say on average, maybe see a dozen or so schools close each year. Based on what I've seen in terms of preliminary data for 2024, there's been some uptick, but it's not too far away from kind of historical levels. And so kind of you have kind of that level of closure. Now, that's against the backdrop of literally thousands of schools across the country. And so when you think about sort of the closure rate relative to sort of the size of the industry, it's fairly small. Again, it is projected to move upward. And so I think it's important to stay vigilant when analyzing credit, but kind of overall, it's still kind of really important to make sure I have that context. Now, in terms of red flags, there are certainly quite a few that come to mind. And I don't think I have enough time to kind of call attention to all of them, but there are a few that I'd like to highlight. One that rarely comes to mind that's, super straightforward is the size of the first year enrollment. If you have sort of a smaller incoming class of freshmen, that could really be a leading indicator in terms of anticipating future pressure on the enrollment base. Since you see that class coming in and you're stuck with that smaller class for at least the next 4 years. So really, really important to be mindful of that. Something else that you should be mindful of is declines in net tuition per student. So I would say student tuition and fees is generally obviously a key revenue stream for many universities. If you're taking a look at sort of total sort of net tuition and fee revenue, that's obviously very helpful. But looking at things on a per student basis provides some more insight in terms of the university's pricing power and relatedly the competitive environment, which is obviously very critical against the backdrop of the demographics that we're seeing. A third item that I think is worthwhile to highlight is, it's atypical, but it does happen. Periodically, you see some sale of capital assets. It's not always a red flag. However, to the extent that proceeds, which are, as to be expected, one time in nature, are used to plug in any holes related to recurring costs in the operating budget, I would certainly interpret that as a red flag. Another thing to highlight would be increasing levels of endowment support. And again, much like the previous example, it's not always a red flag. Sometimes there are these kind of temporary extraordinary draws for some sort of strategic purpose that's ultimately going to be to the benefit of the school. However, if it's recurring and increasing and again used to kind of plug in kind of those budgetary holes, that may ultimately prove to be an unsustainable business practice. And lastly, something that I think is worthwhile to highlight is obviously we live in sort of bond land here. And so if you see kind of schools kind of issuing bonds for near-term operating relief, now whether that's a scoop and toss refinancing to bridge some sort of budget gap or issuing bonds to provide some working capital to essentially solve a near-term structural deficit, that could really be a red flag from our perspective.
So, Liz, I think to wrap things up, I'm going to ask maybe a provocative question. There are people out there, across the country in Silicon Valley, places like that, who are questioning the value of a college degree today, both in terms of time and cost, whether the skills you gain are really relevant. I'm going to guess you disagree. You correct me if I'm wrong, but can you tell me why?
Yeah, I disagree. I think we're in a news and media environment where it's a reflection of if it leads, it bleeds. So we've always known that about newspapers, that bad news will sell more copies than good news. And now that we're in a social media environment where people love to share bad news and their complaints about this, that, and the other thing, we hear a lot of negativity about higher education. But what we know about higher education is that degree attainment makes a difference in lifelong earning, whether it's from high school to an associate's degree, associates to bachelor's, or bachelor's to graduate. We know that those with a college degree have more saved for retirement. They are less likely to lean on government services and government aid in any way. We also know that college graduates are more likely to vote, they're more likely to be charitable donors, and they are more likely to be community contributors and volunteers in other ways. The payoffs of a college degree are vast.
So I think that's a great place to land. Liz Clark, Vice President for Policy at the National Association of College and University Business Officers, NACUBO. Thank you for joining us. And thanks also to Alex Vaisman and Suzanne Finnegan, my colleagues from BAM Mutual, for being here as well. There's a new Muni Creditcast on the last Wednesday every month, so subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. BAM Mutual is rated AA with a stable outlook by S&P Global Ratings, and we insure more than $100 billion of municipal bonds from across the U.S. For more information, please email us at creditinsights@bambonds.com or visit bambonds.com. Thanks.